The Architecture of Survival. A Bulgarian Orthodox inquiry into biology, language, and history. Today, we are asking whether a centuries-old tradition holds something close to a biological antidote to the exhaustion of our modern digital age. To answer that, we will move from the inside out, starting with the brain, moving to the alphabet that carried a civilization's memory, and ending in the historical record of a people who would not let either be taken from them. Here is the shape of where we are going. We begin with the nervous system and a concept called hesychia. From there, we move to language itself and the sacred weight carried inside the Cyrillic script. Then we follow one solitary monk in 1762 who lit a spark that a regime would later try and fail to extinguish. We will sit with that failed extinguishing, the confiscation of a seminary in 1950, because the suppression is part of the proof. We will watch the tradition return after communism, and we will close with the fire at the center of all of it, what Orthodox Bulgarian tradition actually means by holiness. Part 1. The Biological Fire. Let's start with your brain's default mode network. In modern digital life, this network has become something like a machine built for anxiety. It loops over past regret, future fear, and an endless undertow of digital rumination. It rarely rests, it scans. Set against that, researchers studying contemplative traditions have noted something remarkable. Orthodox hesychia, an ancient practice of profound inner stillness, appears to function as a literal biological firewall against exactly this kind of unraveling. Hesychia creates a stable baseline of presence. It trains the default mode network rather than letting the network run wild, and in doing so, it protects the practitioner from the shifting currents of modern cultural distress. The mechanism, as far as we can describe it, comes down to interoceptive precision, the brain's capacity to sense and regulate the body's own internal states. The rhythm of the breath and the movement of the voice during ancient liturgical chant grounds the mind physically in the present moment. By focusing intensely on these internal physical states, practitioners are, in effect, downregulating their autonomic nervous system. They step away from the sympathetic fight-or-flight urgency that external screens are specifically engineered to produce, and they anchor themselves instead in a state that is simultaneously calm and highly alert. Picture a 14th century monk in a mountain cave. He is not merely sitting in silence. He is engaged in concentrated, repetitive prayer, physically anchoring himself through the deliberate rhythm of breath and voice. This is, in effect, an ancient technology for interoceptive awareness, training a person to precisely sense and regulate their own internal physical and emotional states, centuries before neuroscience had language for what was happening. A dysregulated default mode network, the kind common in modern digital life, produces anxious rumination, a mind constantly reacting to cultural noise. A person operating from this grounded state becomes remarkably resistant to the shifting currents of social influence and manufactured urgency. They do not absorb ambient anxiety. They remain anchored. This stillness and this deep cultural identity were not left as abstract philosophy. They were, in time, codified into something physical, an alphabet. Part 2. The Linguistic Anchor. This brings us to the sacred vessel of the Cyrillic script, created in the 9th century during the Bulgarian Golden Age at the Preslav Literary School. The script was not forged merely as a linguistic utility for everyday trade and record-keeping. It was developed intentionally as a sovereign vessel, built to articulate the deepest theological mysteries for the entire Slavic world. As contemporary iconographer Petar Rundev has put it, the script handed down by the Holy Brothers is not a relic of the past. It is a living liturgy, an unbroken chain of prayer, a sacred vessel. This is worth sitting with, because it sets up a fascinating power dynamic that persists into the present. In modern digital communication, English functions mostly as a global vestibule, a secular welcoming doorway for outsiders. But Bulgarian, rooted in Old Church Slavonic, serves as the sovereign living tissue of the tradition itself. It carries theological weight that does not survive translation intact. Take the Bulgarian word for embodied, voplatino. It does not mean embodied in some clinical, detached sense. It means enfleshed. The language itself is a living monument, carrying the liturgical heartbeat of Saints Cyril and Methodius directly into the present day. This linguistic anchor would go on to prove its durability under immense and very real pressure. Part 3. The 1762 Catalyst, sparking a national revival. Picture the year 1762. Working in complete isolation, a solitary monk named Paisius of Highlandar pens the Istoria Slaviano-Bulgarskaya, the Slavic Bulgarian history. Working entirely alone, he uses the Cyrillic script to standardize the liturgical language and fiercely defend Bulgarian identity after 5 full centuries of Ottoman rule. This single text did something that disrupted the reductive narratives of the time. It reminded a people of their unbroken lineage and pushed directly against the erasure they faced. Wielding this linguistic anchor, Paisius single-handedly sparked a massive spiritual and cultural awakening, a national revival that renewed focus on homegrown education throughout the 19th century, ultimately culminating in the inauguration of the Petropavlovska Seminary in 1874, a major step toward cultivating Bulgaria's own theological talent from within. But this historical durability would soon face a far more severe systemic challenge. Part 4. The 1950 Communist Exile, a profound test of resilience. When the Sofia Theological Seminary was officially consecrated in the capital in 1904, it was a genuine modern marvel, electricity, state-of-the-art projection apparatus, sitting prominently beside the Bulgarian parliament as a visible beacon of faith. Then came the mid-20th century, and a communist regime that viewed deeply rooted organized religion as fundamentally incompatible with its ideology. The pressure built and finally broke in September 1950. The regime systematically moved to suppress theological education. The Faculty of Theology was forcibly separated from Sofia University, and the Sofia and Plovdiv seminaries were merged simply to preserve enough of a student body to function at all. The most devastating part came next. The actual seminary buildings, standing in the heart of Sofia, were confiscated outright and handed over to a communist youth group, the Septemvriyach Pioneer Organization. The students and faculty were systematically stripped of their modern facilities, their visibility, and their central role in society, and the institution was forced to relocate to the remote village of Cherepish. Exiled to Cherepish, the seminary faced inadequate facilities, profound isolation, and constant scrutiny from an atheistic regime whose goal was straightforward: silence them, render them invisible, slowly suffocate theological education in the country. And yet this is the part that matters most. Even uprooted and deliberately pushed into the shadows, the institution refused to break. It maintained its academic standards. It tirelessly nurtured the cultural and spiritual life of its students against what should, by any reasonable measure, have been impossible odds. Part 5. Post-communist spiritual recovery, reclaiming its rightful place. With the fall of communism, the seminary returned to its original location in Sofia in 1990. But the return was not a simple homecoming. The institution immediately walked into a severe, government-backed schism within the Bulgarian Orthodox Church and was effectively forced to take a side in a deeply fractured society. Relying on the same deep-rooted architecture of survival that had carried it through exile, the seminary chose unity. It chose loyalty to the recognized leader, Patriarch Maxim, even when doing so meant standing against the government's preferred faction. That steadfastness paid off. By 1995, under new leadership, the Ministry of Education fully recognized the seminary's diplomas as completely equivalent to those of secular schools. Full state recognition, after decades of being hidden away, stripped of resources, and exiled to the mountains. It was a genuine victory, and it proved something important: that an institution could blend an ancient, unbreakable tradition with the practical needs of modern academic life, without compromising either. Throughout this entire period of recovery, the broader Eastern Orthodox Church continued to act as a vital lifeline, a protective wall offering a stable moral structure. By providing spiritual labor, it created a clear path away from despair and self-destruction, helping people who had been broken by decades of suppression regain meaning and endure through trauma. It provided, in the fullest sense, the inner architecture we began this story by describing. Part 6, The Fire of Holiness, Svyatost and Podvig. All of this, the neurology, the language, the history, culminates in a theological goal, and these two definitions are essential if we want to grasp the full picture. In the Bulgarian Orthodox tradition, holiness is not passive, quiet piety, and it is not a static rulebook or a checklist of moral behaviors. It is Svyatost, an intense, overflowing spiritual fire of God's grace that actively radiates outward to impact others. It is a transformative grace that changes a person completely from the inside out, and then naturally affects everyone around them. How is Svyatost actually attained? Through Podvig, the rigorous, active, lifelong spiritual struggle and discipline required to strip away the ego and align oneself completely with God's will. It is an ongoing journey of returning to the deep, rational love and forgiveness of God, with the understanding that even when a person falters, the path back is always open. But there is a vital warning attached to this struggle. Without humility, the effort goes unrecognized. It becomes, in the language of the tradition, like a whitewashed tomb, beautiful on the outside, hollow within. This spiritual striving demands deep humility and the steady guidance of a spiritual father, ensuring that outward devotion is matched by genuine inner transformation. Without that humility, the entire practice collapses into vanity. When the inner transformation does take root, however, the overflowing grace transforms a person from the inside out. It reshapes their relationships and turns them into a radiant source of compassion that draws others toward it without effort or performance. Ultimately, this fire of holiness creates an ongoing cycle of repentance, forgiveness, and genuine community healing. Part 7, The Architecture of Digital Anxiety. Now I want to turn from history toward the present moment, because everything we have just described exists in direct tension with the world most of us live in day to day. Consider how the modern internet is actually built. It is engineered to keep the brain's amygdala constantly scanning for threats. It hijacks the sympathetic nervous system, producing constant microspikes in cortisol. The default mode network, ordinarily the brain's quiet idling engine, gets exploited and turned from a background hum into a machine for anxious rumination. Culturally, this produces a kind of total amnesia. Deep historical context gets wiped out in favor of whatever happens to be trending in this exact moment. It is an architecture built, in a very real sense, to break down psychological stability. This is the thesis we are working against: the fragmented urgency of modern digital life, engineered to keep us hooked, spiking anxiety, locking us into exhausting loops of social mimicry and validation seeking. It is rapid, it is scattered, it is draining. Against that backdrop, contemporary work by iconographer and writer Petar Rundev offers something like an antithesis, a profound stillness he calls cultural hesychia. It is parasympathetic calm, a deliberate, intentional slowing down that draws on deep historical continuity and unshakable truth to provide an actual anchor inside the noise. To be clear, this is not a cool cultural aesthetic. It functions as something closer to a neurological shield, an invisible bedrock that allows a person to remain completely steady while the rest of the digital world is losing itself over whatever the algorithm has decided is today's outrage. Hesychia in this reading is not an abstract idea trapped in old books. It is a lived, active, internal architecture, profound stillness, non-reactive watchfulness, and a permanent clarity. Imagine standing at the eye of a hurricane, the digital world spinning entirely out of control around you, ads and arguments and notifications blasting past, while you maintain an unshakable baseline of internal stability. By living this out rather than merely describing it, this approach bypasses the defensive resistance most of us fall into when we encounter ideas online. It is not a performance of confidence for an audience. It is created from a place of actual peace. And the concept maps directly onto biology, stabilizing the brain's default mode network so that, instead of scattering into anxious distraction, the structural packing of the work itself activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the body's rest and digest mode. By leaning into the natural rhythm of breath and a deliberately liturgical packing, this approach forces a downregulation of cortisol, effectively overriding the stress response to create a state of calm alertness. There is a particular sentence worth sitting with here, because it carries real structural weight. Orthodox theology has given me an interior architecture that remains largely untouched by the shifting currents of social influence and cultural noise. That is a significant claim of structural authority. But what makes it effective rather than merely assertive is that it is paired with real vulnerability, an admission of human fallibility, a confession that even the person making the claim sometimes forgets the depth of his own heritage. That admission dissolves the asymmetric hierarchy between creator and audience. It is not lecturing from a pedestal. It is an invitation into a shared journey. Part 8, the 5-stage sequence. What we are looking at is not simply interesting facts assembled to scroll past. There is a deliberate 5-stage pedagogic sequence at work here, designed to actively restructure the way a reader or viewer processes information. First, the work grounds you in tangible sensory realities. Second, it disrupts whatever reductive stereotypes you might be carrying. Third, it elevates the focus toward cosmic or theological truths. Fourth, it extends a genuine, open invitation to explore further. And fifth, it anchors the nervous system, typically closing with a stabilizing prayer or a statement of permanence. Look closely at the second stage, the disruption, because it is handled with real precision. The reductive Western stereotype of Bulgaria as a cheap tourist destination is not countered by complaint or grievance. It is countered with hyperspecific realities. The ancient Thracian city of Kabille, dating to the 2nd millennium BCE, Lactobacillus bulgaricus, the living bacterium native only to Bulgarian yogurt. These specifics function as an undeniable somatic anchor, proof that this culture is a physical, living reality you can ingest, not merely a line item on a map. Part 9, the geometry of apophatic masking. This brings us to the visual register of the work, because the same logic that governs the writing governs the images, and it is worth understanding the underlying theological concept first. In theology, apophatic masking, the via negativa, approaches something sacred by describing what it is not, rather than asserting positively what it is. Visually, this principle gets translated into a specific compositional choice. Historically heavy symbols are placed in the margins, or rendered in faded midtones, rather than blasted in bright focus at the center of the frame. The effect is to demand that the viewer actively search for meaning rather than passively consume it. Consider a composition built around a stable triangular geometry. The eye is naturally drawn to the center, to a depiction of Christ the Pantocrator measuring the cosmos. But look to the far right margin. Intentionally withdrawn from the primary focus, resting quietly in shadow above the skull of Adam, is the 3-barred Orthodox cross. This is visual apophasis in its purest form. A more conventional, validation-seeking design would place that cross dead center, demanding recognition. Instead, it sits at the edge, using its own structural gravity to anchor the entire composition from within. That visual choice leads to a larger realization. Peripheral does not mean powerless. This compositional principle reframes the entire idea of cultural marginalization. What looks pushed to the edges of global discourse, Eastern European history, Orthodox tradition, turns out to be the structural anchor holding the whole composition together. Marginalization, read this way, becomes unshakable authority rather than weakness. Part 10, the ontology of material translation. This raises a real and difficult question. Can a pixelated digital asset actually hold the sacred authenticity of an ancient relic? Can something carrying that much historical and spiritual weight be digitized without losing any of its depth? The technique that attempts to answer this is what we might call material translation, taking a historical asset's meaning and moving it across mediums while preserving its authenticity, its somatic weight, and its spiritual charge intact. This is not flattening history into weightless pixels. It is stewardship, reactivating historical assets as a continuous living thread inside a modern digital space. Notice, in this context, the the deliberate use of color. Deep amber, gold, and dark blue tones. A technique we might call chromatic phase locking mirror the low-light environment of an ancient temple lit by candlelight. This is not merely an aesthetic preference. It functions as something closer to a signal that physically shifts attention away from the high-alert anxiety cultivated by screens and toward a state of contemplation. When text and image combine in this way, something genuinely multidimensional emerges. The verbal medium is temporal and sequential. It uses dense syntax and liturgical cadence to slow the reader's breath while explaining the psychological mechanics of hesychia directly. The visual medium is simultaneous and spatial. It uses low-frequency color targeting to hold a paradoxical cosmic architecture that the mind grasps all at once, rather than piece by piece. The text regulates the body's sense of time. The image stabilizes spatial awareness. Together, they form a complete instrument. There is also a particular effect worth nomming. When a composition places a modern figure working on a digital tablet directly alongside medieval saints, time itself seems to collapse. Centuries of distance disappear in a single frame. The implicit argument is bold. Modern digital creation can carry exactly the same spiritual weight that monks once carried inscribing vellum by candlelight, centuries ago. A composition like the Descent of the Holy Spirit, for instance, mirrors the same liturgical cadence found in the writing, a visual cue that forces the eye to slow down. And as the eye slows, the breath physiologically slows with it. One more detail deserves attention: the deliberate refusal to translate everything neatly into English. Cyrillic and Greek scripts remain integrated directly into the artwork, untranslated. This is not an aesthetic flourish. It is a form of high-context bilingualism that creates a real visual boundary, an asymmetrical move against the pressure of global secularization. English remains the open gateway through which an outside viewer can enter, but the native scripts retain the true theological weight. It is, in effect, an intrinsic dignity economy, a refusal to dilute ancient heritage simply to satisfy a global algorithm's preference for universal legibility. Part 11, Sovereign Inhabitation. This brings us to the central tension worth sitting with honestly. Most online discourse today is grievance-driven, reactive, defensive, constantly demanding validation from the outside world. It is, frankly, exhausting to participate in or even witness. The approach we have been describing flips this entirely. Call it sovereign inhabitation, gratitude-driven rather than grievance-driven, anchored in a genuine sense of self, operating free from the anxious need for external approval. The mental foundation underneath this is cultural hesychia, understood now not as an abstract aesthetic, but as a lived internal architecture. The same eye of the hurricane stability described earlier, made into a daily practice rather than a one-time insight. So we have to ask the question honestly, because it deserves an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. Is this a transferable toolkit, something the rest of us can actually learn and use? Or is it a singular, deeply personal achievement that cannot be extracted from the specific life that produced it? Can the 5-stage method, grounding, disruption, elevation, invitation, anchoring, be taught and scaled into other domains? Corporate strategy, public health communication, brand design? Or does it strictly require a deeply lived, daily orthodox habitus? A fully embodied, constant spiritual practice that makes it fundamentally unreplicable for someone simply scrolling on their phone? The honest answer sits somewhere between the two extremes. The structural method, the packing, the apophatic restraint, the somatic anchoring, the refusal of grievance, can genuinely be learned and applied elsewhere, and applying it well will produce better, calmer, more trustworthy communication in almost any field. But the deepest register of the work, the place where the stillness is not performed but actually inhabited, draws on a lived tradition that cannot be shortcut. A person can learn the grammar without yet speaking the mother tongue. That is not a failure of the method. It is simply the difference between technique and formation, and recognizing that difference honestly is itself part of what the tradition is trying to teach. What we trace today is a single architecture of survival, built from the inside out. It begins with the neurological stillness cultivated by hesychasm. That stillness creates stable ground for Svyatost, the overflowing, transformative grace at the center of Bulgarian Orthodox holiness. That internal strength is then anchored in the physical world by the living tissue of the Cyrillic script, and it manifests historically in the genuine institutional resilience of the Sofia Theological Seminary. Theology, biology, and historical grit, intertwined into a structure that neither centuries of Ottoman rule nor decades of communist suppression could fully dismantle. To understand why this architecture of survival endured, we need to widen the lens even further. The story does not begin with monasteries, seminaries, or even the Christianization of Bulgaria. It begins much earlier, in a land whose memory stretches back through layers of civilization so deep that they often disappear beneath the compressed timelines of modern discourse. Long before Bulgaria existed as a state, the lands between the Danube, the Black Sea, and the Balkan Mountains were inhabited by the Thracians. Their presence remains embedded throughout the landscape in tombs, sanctuaries, gold treasures, and sacred sites that continue to emerge from the earth even today. The famous panegyric treasure, the Valley of the Thracian Kings, and the ancient city of Kabille are not merely archaeological curiosities. They are reminders that this region has functioned as a crossroads of civilizations for millennia. Yet geography can be both a gift and a burden. Situated between Europe and Asia, between empires and trade routes, Bulgaria repeatedly found itself at the center of struggles larger than itself. Roman armies marched through these lands. Byzantine emperors fought to control them. Crusaders crossed them. Ottoman armies occupied them. Great powers negotiated over them. Again and again, history placed Bulgaria directly in the path of forces capable of erasing smaller nations entirely. The remarkable fact is not that Bulgaria suffered these pressures. The remarkable fact is that Bulgaria survived them. The First Bulgarian Empire emerged in 681 and rapidly became one of the most influential states in medieval Europe. Under rulers such as Khan Tervel, who helped halt the Umayyad advance into Europe, and later under Tsar Simeon the Great, Bulgaria transformed from a regional power into a genuine civilizational center. The reign of Simeon is often described as a golden age, and for good reason. Literature flourished, theology flourished, education flourished. The Preslav and Ohrid literary schools became engines of intellectual life whose influence extended far beyond Bulgaria's borders. It was here that the cultural foundations of the Slavic Orthodox world were consolidated and transmitted across vast territories. This is an important distinction. Empires often measure their success through conquest. Civilizations measure their success through what they leave behind. The armies of many medieval powers have long since vanished. Their banners have faded. Their fortifications have crumbled. Yet the spiritual, linguistic, and cultural inheritance transmitted through Bulgaria's literary tradition continues to shape the lives of millions of people today. That inheritance would later find defenders in every generation. Consider Vasil Levski. Modern discussions often reduce him to the role of revolutionary hero, but doing so risks missing the deeper significance of his life. Levski envisioned a Bulgaria founded not merely on ethnic identity or political independence, but on justice, dignity, and responsibility. He spoke of a republic in which all people, regardless of faith or background, would stand equal before the law. Such ideas were extraordinary for their time. Levski understood something profound. Liberation begins internally before it manifests politically. A nation incapable of governing itself spiritually will struggle to govern itself politically. Freedom requires discipline. Independence requires character. Alongside him stood figures such as Hristo Botev, whose poetry remains among the most powerful expressions of sacrifice and moral courage in Bulgarian literature. Botev's writings reveal a man wrestling not merely with political oppression, but with the meaning of human dignity itself. His words continue to resonate because they speak to something universal, the willingness to surrender comfort for a greater truth. These men became symbols, not because they were flawless. They became symbols because they embodied Podvig. The same spiritual struggle described earlier in the Orthodox tradition appeared in a different register within the national revival. The battlefield changed. The vocabulary changed. Yet the underlying principle remained remarkably similar: disciplined sacrifice undertaken for something greater than oneself. This pattern continued into the modern era. Statesmen such as Alexander Stamboliski sought to navigate the immense social and political pressures facing Bulgaria in the 20th century. Whether one agrees with every decision he made is beside the point. What matters is that generation after generation produced individuals willing to shoulder responsibility during periods of extraordinary uncertainty. This continuity deserves attention because modern culture often assumes that identity is primarily a matter of personal preference. The historical record suggests something different. Identity is transmitted. It is inherited. It is cultivated. Every generation receives a treasury and then decides whether to preserve it, enrich it, or squander it. The Bulgarian Orthodox tradition played a unique role in that transmission. Throughout centuries of upheaval, monasteries functioned not only as centers of prayer, but as repositories of memory. They preserved manuscripts. They educated clergy. They copied texts. They maintained continuity during periods when political institutions rose and fell with alarming frequency. The monastery was often far more than a religious institution. It was an archive, a school, a library, a refuge, a memory palace for an entire civilization. This is why the Eastern Orthodox identity of Bulgaria cannot be reduced to a demographic category on a census form. It represents a complete worldview, a way of understanding history, suffering, community, beauty, forgiveness, and the human person. At its best, Orthodoxy does not ask whether life contains suffering. It assumes suffering exists. The question becomes what meaning can be discovered within it. This perspective profoundly shaped Bulgarian cultural development. It encouraged endurance without fatalism, humility without passivity, patience without surrender. The saints, monks, teachers, poets, and ordinary believers who carried the tradition forward were not preserved because history was kind to them. They endured because they learned how to transform adversity into formation. That distinction remains relevant today. The modern world offers unprecedented convenience. It offers unlimited information. It offers constant connection. Yet many people find themselves experiencing profound disconnection from history, community, and even their own interior life. The result is a peculiar paradox. We possess more information than any civilization in human history, yet often struggle to locate meaning. We are more connected than ever, yet frequently feel isolated. We communicate constantly, yet rarely encounter silence. The Bulgarian experience offers an alternative perspective. It reminds us that resilience is not created by comfort alone. It emerges from continuity, from memory, from gratitude, from knowing who came before us and why their sacrifices mattered. Perhaps this explains why figures separated by centuries, a medieval monk copying manuscripts by candlelight, a revivalist carrying forbidden books across mountain paths, a seminarian studying in exile during communism, and a modern creator working quietly in a digital world, can all appear as chapters of the same story. The tools change. The circumstances change. The challenges change. But the deeper architecture remains remarkably constant. A people remembers. A tradition endures. A flame is handed forward. And so the story of Bulgarian Orthodoxy is ultimately not a story about the past at all. It is a story about continuity, a living bridge connecting generations separated by centuries. A reminder that cultural memory, when united with spiritual conviction, can outlast empires, survive ideologies, and continue illuminating paths long after seemingly greater powers have vanished into history. That continuity may be one of Bulgaria's greatest gifts to the modern world. The quiet demonstration that identity rooted in truth, memory, and spiritual depth possesses a resilience far stronger than the shifting fashions of any particular age. Cultural hesychia. Petar Rundev's commentary. The writing I share is not a calculated digital content strategy or an engineered piece of marketing, but a cohesive theoria, a unified way of seeing, and a deliberate expression of my creative and spiritual life. This work serves as an intentional bridge between ancient civilizational depth and the fragmented nature of modern digital perception. I pace these narratives to function as a form of cultural quietude, using a deliberate application of stillness and rhythmic language to gently settle the reader's focus. By inviting people to step away from the constant urgency of modern media and enter a state of calm alertness, I try to prepare the mental soil for deeper historical and spiritual ideas. The core objective across my three-part narrative arc is to assert an inherent cultural dignity that naturally declines to negotiate with global trends for recognition or validation. I speak from a perspective of natural wholeness, treating tradition as a timeless standard that measures the modern world, rather than a relic to be measured by it. This quiet sovereignty over our narrative is marked by a complete absence of resentment or grievance. I choose to meet external stereotypes not with defensiveness, but with the understanding that they merely represent an epistemological failure, a simple lack of context on the part of the observer. This shifts my work away from defensive apology, transforming it into an open invitation to join me in a sovereign, lived experience. To break through shallow, reductive perceptions of Bulgaria as a mere tourist destination or a peripheral nation, I ground my writing in highly specific, tangible realities. By bypassing vague, abstract praise and offering concrete regional truths, I encourage the reader to reset their understanding. When I highlight the ancient city of Kabille, a regional center from the 2nd millennium BCE that far predates modern political borders, I am demonstrating that these lands have been central to European cultural history for millennia, shifting the perspective away from a minor nation mindset. Kabille's past is layered like almost nowhere else in the Balkans. Situated near modern Yambol on the Tunja River, it began as a Thracian settlement as early as the 2nd millennium BCE and grew into one of the most important urban centers of the Thracian Odrysian kingdom, minting its own coinage by the 4th century BCE, a mark of real political and economic weight, not a minor outpost. Alexander the Great is recorded to have passed through the region during his Balkan campaign, and the city later became a key link in Thracian trade routes running toward the Black Sea. When Rome absorbed Thrace into its provincial system, Kabille did not decline. It was refortified and garrisoned as a Roman military stronghold, and it continued to matter into the Byzantine period, with fortification walls and a basilica still visible from that later Christian layer. Few sites anywhere let you stand in one place and touch a Thracian sanctuary, a Hellenistic city plan, Roman defensive walls, and an early Christian church, all within the same few hundred meters. Kabille today is preserved as an archaeological reserve, and excavation has been ongoing for decades, uncovering residential quarters, a Thracian sanctuary, city gates, and Roman-era baths and fortifications. It functions now as an open-air museum and active dig site rather than a ruin behind glass. Archaeologists continue to work the site each season, and new finds are still being cataloged. For a visitor, that is part of what makes it remarkable. You are not looking at a static monument frozen at one moment in history, but at a place still giving up its layers, still being read. It stands, quite literally, as physical proof that these lands were a functioning, cosmopolitan part of the ancient world's political and trade networks. Thracian, Macedonian, Roman, Byzantine, long before the idea of Bulgaria as a modern nation-state existed, and long before anyone could dismiss this region as peripheral to European history. When I invoke Lactobacillus bulgaricus, I am intentionally grounding our identity in our natural ecology and daily diet, proving that our culture is a physical, living reality tied to the very air and earth. Even my focus on Paisius of Highlandars 1762, Catalyst frames our literary awakening as a spiritual renewal, presenting the Cyrillic script not merely as a linguistic utility, but as a historic vessel developed to bring clarity and illumination to the broader Slavic world. These real-world touchstones ground the reader, inviting them to step past superficial impressions and cultivate a meaningful, balanced historical consciousness. An honest look at my motivation reveals a profound departure from typical online promotion. This work functions primarily as a personal creative offering rather than a sales pitch for techniques. This is reflected in the complete absence of conversion pressure and in the natural, unforced relationship between the languages I use. The English text serves as an open gateway for a global audience, while the Bulgarian text naturally retains the specific idioms, cadence, and inner depth of the original thought. Perhaps the most defining moment in my writing is the open admission of my own human fallibility, where I confess that I, too, sometimes overlook the profound depth of the traditions I carry. Rather than a calculated rhetorical device to disarm the reader, this honesty reflects genuine humility, removing any artificial hierarchy between my writing and the reader. By normalizing the challenges of modern forgetfulness, my texts become a shared journey of remembrance rather than a lecture. The visual compositions accompanying my texts are spatial reflections of this same inner logic, using visual elements to preserve and express the weight of historic symbols. I rely on stable, classical geometry to mirror the psychological intent of the text, to provide a sense of internal order that remains unaffected by passing cultural trends. I deliberately exercise restraint by placing elements like the traditional Orthodox cross within the margins, rather than forcing them loudly into the center of the frame. Where a defensive creator might place symbols of heritage aggressively in the foreground, my restraint reflects the actual place of tradition today, quiet, steady, and structurally anchoring the entire composition from within. Furthermore, by bridging historic imagery with contemporary creation, I collapse the artificial distance between past centuries and the present day, treating modern digital tools with the same creative respect as historical mediums, to prove that our tradition is a continuous living thread rather than a static archive. My writing follows a natural, organic path that leads the reader gently into a deeper awareness of a reality they might already intuitively sense. I begin by grounding the reader in a familiar, sensory scene, local fruits, quiet summer mornings, or neighbors sharing coffee outside, to establish a peaceful baseline. From there, I introduce specific, overlooked historical or cultural realities to challenge superficial perceptions. I then elevate these details to reveal their deeper cultural meaning, viewing our language and script as living monuments. This allows me to extend a genuine invitation, encouraging the reader to look beyond modern distractions and explore this depth for themselves. Finally, I anchor the narrative by returning to foundational ideas, allowing the reader's thoughts to rest in a space of permanent clarity. Widen the lens to the broader historical canvas, and this narrative structure expands into a profound study of geopolitical and temporal endurance. Where this comes from. For the viewer, I want to say this. I do not write only as a historian or as a former seminarian. It was 2008. I was 16 years old, studying at the Bulgarian Sofia Theological Seminary, St. John of Rila, where Old Church Slavonic and English became a kind of second nature to me. My English teacher was Mr. Stoyanov. He was 98 years old at the time, and it was in his classroom that I spoke English for the very first time. Returning to our topic, when I introduce the ancient Thracian roots embedded in our landscape, the panegyric treasure, and the valley of the Thracian kings, I am pulling the reader back through layers of civilization that dwarf the compressed, frantic timelines of modern digital discourse. By framing the lands between the Danube, the Black Sea, and the Balkan Mountains as a literal crossroads of empires, where Roman, Byzantine, Crusader, and Ottoman forces clashed, I demonstrate that the architecture of survival was forged under the highest conceivable systemic pressure. This survival is given structural shape through the lens of civilizational statehood, rather than mere military conquest. I look to the birth of the First Bulgarian Empire in 681, examining how Khan Tervel's critical defense against the Umayyad advance secured a broader European stability, and how Tsar Simeon the Great's golden age transformed the country into a spiritual and intellectual powerhouse. By highlighting the Preslav and Ohrid literary schools, I argue that while the armies and banners of empires inevitably crumble, a civilization's true baseline is measured by the linguistic and theological inheritance it leaves behind to shape future millions. These two schools deserve to be understood as more than a footnote. The Preslav literary school, founded in the capital under Tsar Boris I and flourishing under his son Simeon, is where the Glagolitic script brought north by the disciples of Cyril and Methodius was refined into the Cyrillic alphabet we still use today, closer in form to Greek uncial letters, and far easier to teach, copy, and spread across the Slavic world. Scholars there, among them Constantine of Preslav and John Exarch, produced original theological and philosophical works, not merely translations, at a pace and depth that placed Bulgaria among the intellectual centers of the medieval world. It was here that the very first Slavic language literature, sermons, hymns, historical and scientific writing, came into being. At the same time, in the west of the empire, the Ohrid literary school was doing parallel work under Saint Clement of Ohrid and Saint Naum, both direct disciples of Cyril and Methodius. Clement is credited with personally training thousands of students and producing an extraordinary body of homilies and liturgical texts, effectively building the first organized system of Slavic language education in Europe. Between Preslav and Ohrid, within a single generation, Bulgaria had gone from receiving the Slavic script as a gift to becoming the workshop where it was standardized, taught, and launched outward, into Serbia, into Rus, into the whole of the Orthodox Slavic world. That is the linguistic and theological inheritance, I mean. Not an abstraction, but two actual schools, with names and founders we still know, doing the patient work that outlasted every army of their age. Podvig, spiritual struggle made human. To bring this architecture into focus as a lived human reality, I channel the concept of Podvig, spiritual struggle and disciplined sacrifice, through our historical figures. I reframe the revolutionary icon Vasil Levski, stripping away standard political sentimentality to reveal his deeper message, that external liberation is entirely hollow without internal, spiritual governance and moral character. Alongside him, I bring the searing poetry of Hristo Botev into the present, showing a man who willingly surrendered temporal comfort for cosmic truths. Even 20th century statesmen like Alexander Stamboliyski are treated as part of this unbroken lineage of individuals who shouldered systemic responsibility during periods of existential uncertainty. Finally, I locate the physical sanctuary of this memory within our monastic tradition. I describe how, throughout centuries of upheaval, our monasteries functioned not as isolated retreats, but as active memory palaces, archives, and defensive walls for a complete worldview. By viewing history through this lens, I challenge the modern paradox, where we find ourselves drowning in unlimited digital information, yet starved of actual meaning. Ultimately, this expanded historical record serves as the definitive proof of my thesis, that an identity rooted in deep continuity, genuine gratitude, and spiritual depth possesses a quiet resilience capable of outlasting the shifting fashions, algorithms, and ideologies of any modern age. As someone who studied at the Bulgarian Sofia Theological Seminary, St. John of Rila, and abroad, I cannot stress enough the importance of the Bulgarian heritage we have left to the world. I have always encouraged expats to study Bulgarian spirituality, tradition, and civilization. As I mentioned earlier, Bulgaria welcomes anyone, as long as you come with respect for our culture, our deep history, and the honesty of the Bulgarian people. If you want to truly know us, look past the tourist resorts. Come and talk to our elders as they gather outside the residential blocks for afternoon tea, coffee, fresh local cherries, and watermelons. This simple act of community is a living tradition of Bulgarian hospitality. Step into our national libraries and historic house museums, like those in Plovdiv, Koprivshtitsa, and Veliko Tarnovo, which stood as bastions of education, national revival, and literature when our culture was under threat. Go to our mountains and explore their rugged terrains. Bulgaria is home to some of Europe's oldest and most diverse landscapes. Visit Halkata, the Loop, near Sliven, a miraculous rock phenomenon steeped in local myths of ancient Hayduks, freedom fighters. Scale Karandilla within the Blue Stones National Park, or explore the deep paths of Dolopite. Walk through Kabille, an ancient Thracian city dating back to the 2nd millennium BCE, which later became a major Roman military stronghold, proving that our lands were a cradle of European civilization long before modern borders existed. Visit our Orthodox monasteries. Rila Monastery, founded in the 10th century by St. Ivan of Rila, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site that served as the spiritual and cultural keeper of Bulgarian identity for 1,000 years. Explore Bakovo Monastery, founded in 1083, blending Byzantine, Georgian, and Bulgarian traditions, or the centuries-old spiritual hubs around Sofia. The surrounding nature parks and sacred atmospheres have been fiercely protected and preserved by locals for generations. Travel to the mountain town of Bansko to stand before the memorial of Paisius of Highlandar, who in 1762 penned Istoria Slaviana Bulgarskaya and single-handedly sparked our national revival. Understand that this literary awakening was only possible because Bulgaria is the true birthplace of the Cyrillic script, developed in the 9th century during our golden age at the Preslav Literary School. From here, our letters spread to illuminate the entire Slavic world. Descend then into the stunning Rose Valley, the heart of our world-famous damask red roses, where we produce the finest rose oil on earth. I am well aware of the unfair stereotypes that exist about our country, but they only exist because people don't read, don't talk, and don't look deeper. Let us research, learn, and respect history. Only then will we see the world around us as something more meaningful, inspiring, and balanced. It is a mutual responsibility, befalling all of us, to keep our people's image pure and intact. On May 24th, in Bulgaria, we do not celebrate mere letters. I repeat this because when this holy day arrives, I too sometimes overlook its true depth, and, at times, we all omit the sacred power it carries with it, a power that strengthens our society, the Slavic world, and the Orthodox Christian inheritance entrusted to us. What we truly celebrate on the 24th of May is the mystery of a spiritual work that permanently altered the destiny of entire nations. On this sacred day, we bow our heads before the holy brothers Cyril and Methodius, equal to the apostles and enlighteners, through whom God granted the Slavic peoples language, literacy, and the divine capacity to glorify Christ in their own native tongue. When we honor the Glagolitic and Cyrillic scripts, we are not merely commemorating an alphabet used to record historical events or preserve the passing moments of earthly existence. We are touching a sacred vessel. Think of the solitary Bulgarian monks, like the chronicler Isaiah, lamenting the tragic final days of Tsar Ivan Shishman, pouring his grief and faith onto parchment. I have personally included, alongside this reflection, a recording of Isaiah's Battle of Chernomen, performed by the contemporary Bulgarian group Hesychia. The text is in Old Bulgarian. The Battle of Chernomen itself took place in 1371. Now consider, too, the centuries of priests chanting the ancient Old Church Slavonic melodies during the Divine Liturgy. The Bulgarian language is a living, breathing monument, shaped through centuries of continuity, preservation, and transformation, until it became the tongue we speak today. It is a testament to survival, adaptation, and resilience. However, a profound truth remains. If we know only modern Bulgarian, we remain confined within the limitations of the present. Without our roots, we lose the ability to step beyond those boundaries and to shape richer, more nuanced, and authentically Bulgarian forms of expression. The ability to truly understand the liturgy, to read old Bulgarian texts, and to discern the spiritual architecture of the Glagolitic and Cyrillic traditions is among the greatest gifts of this feast. It grants us linguistic and intellectual freedom. By viewing our language through the lens of its ancient origins, we unlock a higher level of expression, enabling us to articulate thoughts with the clarity, depth, gravity, and precision of the scholars of our golden age. This extends beyond linguistics alone. Modern language cannot fully reproduce the way in which the early monks and priests experienced these sacred texts while chanting them in prayer. The rhythm of the breath, the movement of the voice, and the deep concentration of liturgical prayer were not abstract concepts for our ancestors, but a living and embodied spiritual experience. When we study, preserve, and remember the chants of the Church Slavonic tradition, we do not merely analyze history from a distance. We enter into the same spiritual inheritance that sustained our forefathers. We are granted the rare opportunity to step into a deeper continuity with the generations who stood in the candle-lit silence of our oldest Orthodox temples, experiencing the living word as a present reality. The deed of Saints Cyril and Methodius is far greater than secular enlightenment or basic literacy. They gave our ancestors the means to preserve, for the ages, the authentic spirit, character, and inner depth of the Bulgarian soul. They codified a sacred language capable of carrying both the highest theological mysteries and the deepest human emotions through the centuries. Let us remember that letters alone are dead without the spirit that breathes life into them. As I have put it elsewhere, the script handed down to us by the Holy Brothers is not a relic of the past to be preserved behind museum glass. It is a living liturgy, an unbroken chain of prayer that binds our modern hearts to the saints of our golden age. And here, a verse from Scripture to elaborate further on this theme. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John 1:1. Through the holy intercessions of Saints Cyril and Methodius, may the Lord God preserve the Bulgarian tongue, strengthen our holy Orthodox Church, and keep our hearts anchored in the sacred truths handed down by our ancestors. May we always speak, create, and live in a manner that glorifies His holy name. Let us preserve and cultivate the study of Old Bulgarian, Church Slavonic, and the literary heritage of our golden age, so that future generations may remain connected to the historical, cultural, and liturgical depth of our civilization. A closing reflection on heritage, suffering, and hope. Let me pause here and walk through that history more fully, because the weight of what I've been describing only lands once you see the full arc of it. Bulgaria's story does not begin with the Bulgarians. Long before any Slavic tribe or Bulgar horsemen set foot on these lands, the Thracians had already built a civilization here, one of the oldest in Europe. Herodotus himself wrote that the Thracians would have been the most powerful people on earth had they ever been united under one ruler. Herodotus is an ancient Greek historian and geographer from Halicarnassus, modern-day Bodrum, Turkey. He is widely recognized as the father of history, a title given to him by the Roman orator Cicero, because he was the first writer to perform systematic investigations of historical events. What the Thracians left behind speaks for itself. The golden treasures of Panegyrisk and Valchitran, the beehive tombs of the valley of the Thracian kings near Kazanlak, the city of Kabille with its layers of habitation stretching back to the 2nd millennium BCE. This was not a peripheral backwater waiting to be discovered by Rome. It was a crossroads civilization in its own right, one that Rome eventually absorbed, fortified, and built upon, not the other way around. Then came the Slavs, migrating into the Balkans in waves, and the Bulgars, a formidable steppe people under Khan Aspara, who in 681 forced Byzantium to formally recognize a new state south of the Danube, the First Bulgarian Empire. This is the founding date of Bulgaria itself, and it makes Bulgaria one of the oldest continuously named states in Europe. Within decades, under Khan Tervel, Bulgarian forces would help break the Umayyad siege of Constantinople in 717, a battle historians increasingly credit with having helped preserve Christian Europe from Umayyad conquest, alongside Charles Martel's better-known victory at Tours 15 years later. Few people in the West are taught that a Bulgarian Khan stood at that hinge point of history. The 9th century brought the truly civilizational turn, the mission of Saints Cyril and Methodius, and the reception of their disciples, Saints Clement and Naum of Ohrid chief among them, into Bulgaria after they were expelled from Great Moravia. It was on Bulgarian soil, at the Preslav and Ohrid literary schools, that the Cyrillic script was refined and the first great flowering of Slavic literature took place. Tsar Boris's conversion of Bulgaria to Christianity in 864, and his decision to adopt the Slavic liturgy rather than Greek or Latin, was a civilizational choice whose consequences rippled across 1,000 years. It meant that Kievan Rus, Serbia, and the whole of the Orthodox Slavic world would eventually receive their scripture, their liturgy, and their alphabet through a Bulgarian channel. Under Tsar Simeon the Great, at the turn of the 10th century, Bulgaria reached what historians call its Golden Age, its territory stretching from the Adriatic to the Black Sea, its capital Preslav rivaling Constantinople in scholarship and architecture, and its literary output shaping the written culture of half a continent. That empire did not last forever. Byzantium reconquered Bulgaria in 1018, and for a century and a half Bulgarians lived under Byzantine rule, before the Asen brothers led a revolt that restored Bulgarian statehood in 1185, inaugurating the Second Bulgarian Empire, with its own golden moment under Tsar Ivan Asen. But the 14th century brought fragmentation, and then the Ottoman conquest. Tarnovo fell in 1393, and by 1396, Bulgaria had ceased to exist as a state for the first time since 681. 5 centuries of Ottoman rule followed. This is the darkness the chronicler Isaiah was writing into when he lamented the fall of Tsar Ivan Shishman. It is the same darkness Paisius of Highlandar was writing against in 1762 in a monastic cell on Mount Athos, when he insisted that Bulgarians remember they had once had czars, saints, and a written history of their own, and that forgetting it was itself a form of surrender. Paisius's Historia Slaviano-Bulgarskaya lit the long fuse of the national revival, a century of quiet, grinding cultural labor, building schools, printing books, founding reading rooms or chitaliszta in towns like Plovdiv and Koprivshtitsa, and slowly restoring a Bulgarian church hierarchy independent of the Greek Patriarchate, finally achieved in 1870 with the founding of the Bulgarian Exarchate. This cultural revival, not diplomacy or conquest, is what made the political liberation of 1878 possible at all, when Russian and Bulgarian volunteer forces defeated the Ottoman army in the Russo-Turkish War, and Bulgaria re-emerged as a state after 500 years. Vasil Levski, Hristo Bodov, and the generation of revolutionaries who did not live to see that liberation are honored precisely because they staked everything on the belief that a nation could not be free politically until it had first refused to be erased spiritually. The 20th century tested that inheritance again through 2 Balkan wars, 2 world wars, and then more than 4 decades of communist rule, during which the state confiscated church property, dissolved seminaries, and did everything in its power to sever people from exactly the liturgical and historical memory I have been describing throughout this commentary. And yet the tradition did not die. It survived in villages, in the quiet persistence of monasteries, in grandmothers teaching prayers in kitchens where it was safer than a classroom. When communism fell in 1989, the church, the language, and the historical memory were still there to be picked back up, bruised, but intact. I share all of this not as a history lecture for its own sake, but because it is the actual scaffolding behind everything else I have said. The elders with their tea and cherries, the Cyrillic letters, the monasteries functioning as memory palaces, the church as a quiet refuge in moments of despair. None of it is sentiment layered onto nothing. It rests on 13 centuries of a people being pressed, nearly erased, and choosing again and again to remain. Here I want to reflect, personally, on the heritage God has poured onto our ancestors, and on the responsibilities that come with God's grace, love, and support. We are reminded that in an age, a century, a time, where we so often follow created cultural models, we ought to return to the uncreated cultural model. The teachings that come from the lives of the founders of the church, the desert fathers, the prophets, and the figures of scripture, carry with them a relieving sense of reassurance, of hope, something rational, universal, and yet timeless, as though it predates the limits and essence of this world. The Eastern Orthodox Church stands still and endures through time. Even when mocked, attacked, or misunderstood, it remains marvelous, solemn, and spiritually pure. Throughout my life experience in Orthodox countries, I have heard people quietly say, "I wanted to end my life, but the Church forbids it." Even in silence, the Church acts. Its image, spiritual authority, moral structure, liturgy, prayers, clergy, and presence within society become a protective wall in moments when the human mind is collapsing under pain. Because of the Eastern Orthodox Church and the spiritual labor of clergy, families, monasteries, and faithful communities, many people have stepped back from suicidal thoughts and chosen to endure one more day in order to remain within the path of Orthodox Christian life. And often, after the darkest moment passes, healing slowly begins. When a person reaches the mental state of contemplating suicide, the suffering is usually not caused by one single conflict, but by many layered wounds, internal contradictions, emotional exhaustion, chronic stress, trauma, despair, loneliness, and disturbances within the nervous system and the cognitive balance of the mind. A person does not need to fully understand neurobiology, hormones, stress chemistry, or the mechanisms of the brain in order to begin healing. Sometimes the first step toward restoration is simply to live within a stable moral and spiritual foundation. When human beings begin practicing spiritual discipline, prayer, repentance, humility, responsibility, order, fasting, patience, and meaningful relationships, the body and mind gradually begin responding to that structure. Modern science increasingly shows that repeated patterns of thought, behavior, environment, and belief influence the nervous system, emotional regulation, stress responses, and even the strengthening of neural pathways within the brain. The human organism continuously adapts to what it repeatedly lives in. And this is where the wisdom of the Orthodox Church becomes deeply profound. The Church does not give philosophy, it gives the way to life, Christ himself. A life capable of protecting the soul from self-destruction, restoring inner order, and helping broken people slowly regain meaning, stability, conscience, strength, and hope. Not every person heals instantly. Not every suffering disappears quickly. And those struggling with suicidal thoughts should never be condemned, mocked, or abandoned. But many people remain alive today because, somewhere in their conscience, one thought remained: I must not destroy the life God gave me. And sometimes it is this single thought that becomes the thin line between death and survival, before a healed state is finally reached. Glory to you, our God, glory to you. Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, who abides everywhere and fulfills all things, treasure of good and giver of life, come and dwell in us and cleanse us from all impurity and save, O Blessed One, our souls. Amen.